Hey everyone, it's me Lone. Hope you're doing alright. We are back with another Starfield video, the one that I promised in my Fallout 5 video where I mentioned the Todd Howard IGN interview that was conducted recently. In that interview, yes, he talked about Fallout 5 and Elder Scrolls 6, but the main point of the interview was about Starfield. Todd really deep dived into the game, the mechanics, the story, all that kind of stuff, and I want to provide my thoughts on what he said in that interview. If you missed it, it is linked in the description below, but we'll be doing that in today's video. If you go on to enjoy it, please like, I would really appreciate it. It does help out the channel a lot. And if you're new, subscribe because we're going to be covering Starfield in a lot more detail over the coming weeks and months, in addition to other Bethesda news. So let's jump right into that Todd Howard IGN interview. Alright, so first up, Todd comments on probably the most controversial aspect of the Starfield gameplay reveal, and that was the point about there being over 1,000 explorable planets in the game. And Ryan McCaffrey asked about that in the interview when he said, you're probably going to have a lot of procedural generation when it comes to those planets. And Todd says they're going to have to deep dive into this in the future, and a side note, I hope that they do. But he goes on to say that a space game is going to involve a lot of planets and being able to explore them. Yes, we do a lot of procedural generation, but he stresses that they've always done that, and he recalls the example of generating landscapes in Skyrim. So when you're dealing with procedural system, he says, the difference between one planet and 1,000 planets isn't actually that big of a leap when you have a good procedural system in place. The key is, in Starfield, is that BGS has done more handcrafting in this game content-wise than any other game that they've done. And he also mentions that there's over 200,000 lines of dialogue, and if you do the main quest, you're going to see and do typically what you expect from a Bethesda Game Studios main quest. But then he mentions there's this whole other part of the game of just wandering around a planet, which provides gameplay and other random content just like in Daggerfall. And then he also says if you want to go to land on a weird planet, build an outpost, live your life there, and watch the sunset, you can do that. Alrighty, so this discussion I mentioned in a previous video, so I'm not going to labor on it a bit too much. But yes, we need to recognize that BGS, as Todd has said, has used procedural generation in a lot of their games in the past. He mentioned Skyrim, I mentioned Oblivion, Daggerfall, Arena. It's been used a lot. Granted, they started off using it a lot, especially as they had a smaller team back then, and then they went away from it a little bit when it came with their games like Skyrim and Fallout 4, even though they still used it, but now they're going to be using it a lot more when it comes to Starfield, right? And especially when it comes to the 1,000 playable planets or explorable planets. But he says the key is that in this game, they've done more handcrafting in Starfield than any other BGS game. Now, we have to take those kind of grandioid, big statements with a grain of salt. You always have to. 1,000 playable planets, over 200,000 lines of dialogue, more handcrafting than in any other game. It doesn't mean much, right? He says it because he's trying to be vague. He doesn't want to give away too much information right now, but we always need to be a little bit careful with these big statements. But that being said, yes, that's the important bit. It's not, we shouldn't just be scared that they're using procedural generation. The key is how much they go back and comb through and add the handcrafting stuff. The thing that I did want to point out though is that Todd always makes this distinction when it comes to handcrafting in terms of content, so quests, dialogue, etc., things that you can actually do in the game, and then handcrafting when it comes to landscapes and the exploration aspect of a game, because they're two very different things. And I think Todd says, when he says handcrafting, I think he's more referring to the content itself. So not like having repeatable quests, but a lot of individual quests, a lot of unique dialogue. I think he's referring to handcrafting more in that sense, rather than handcrafting when it comes to these 1,000 playable planets and what you can actually find and how they differ from planet to planet. So I still very much expect that a lot of these planets, because there are so many, I'm not going to feel this. They'll look different. Like the rocks might be different, the gravity might be different, the flora and the fauna might be different from planet to planet. But for the most part, you're going to be kind of wandering around, not finding too much. There might be some resource generation that you need to do. You might find a cool planet that you want to call your home. But I don't imagine in the vast majority of these planets that there's going to be something completely different on every single one of these planets. For the most part, they're going to feel samey. But what's going to matter is in the other areas of the game when it comes to handcrafting, content, questing, dialogue, stuff, factions, stuff like that, right? So I think we need to temper our expectations a little bit when it comes to how many planets there are. That's clearly not necessarily meant to be the main selling point of the game. It's probably meant to be the content, which I wish that they focus more on the side quests and that other stuff, but that's probably going to come in a later interview or a later presentation, whatever it might be, depending upon when the game is actually released. So yeah, let's be a little bit careful about the 1,000 playable planets point. It's not like blowing me away, and I'm being a little bit hesitant on it. But anyways, let's move on. So then he mentioned space combat, and Ryan McCaffrey asks, is it going to be shallow? How deep is it? Todd says that there's two things that they started off when it comes to Starfield: the planet procedural generation and the space combat. He goes on to say they want the space combat to feel unique. Your ship has various power systems, how much power goes into the different weapon systems, engines, the shield, the grab drive to allow you to get out of a jam. There is some dogfighting, he says, in the game, but they keep the pace fairly slow. And I think we got a bit of a sense of that, when it came to the gameplay. It didn't seem too fast. And then he says in terms of the system and power, the game comparison that he likes to use is probably Mech Warrior for any of you that have played that game in the past. But yes, it isn't really a twitchy dogfighter when it comes to the space combat at least. And then finally he says, you can even dock with other ships, disable them, board them. There are quests involved with this. You can steal ships. There is also dialogue in space. There's star stations that you can visit. There's smuggling, etc. So it's actually a good chunk of gameplay. So this all sounds really good to me, right? I think that when it comes to the space combat and just like the space flying aspect of the game, it needs to hit home. It needs to be a big chunk of the game. It's a space game. It's a space game with over 1,000 playable planets. If all it is, you fly to one system, shoot some ships, and that's it, it's going to be a bit of a letdown, especially for a game that BGS has spent so long developing. So I'm really liking what Todd is saying here. Again, take it with a grain of salt, but the fact that there's quests involved with it, 100% that's what we need. The fact that you can steal ships is freaking awesome. It seems like they've thought about the space combat a lot, especially since it's a feature that they started planning off with, in addition to the planets. So hopefully it is not shallow. Hopefully it's really thought out. It can actually be a decent aspect of the game. I think games like, let's recall Assassin's Creed Black Flag, when they actually brought in the ship combat. Was it with Black Flag? Was the previous game? Black Flag, it was really good anyways. I really enjoyed the ship combat when it came to Black Flag, and it became a fun aspect of the game in addition to the main bit, right? So hopefully BGS can take it up another notch when it comes to space combat in Starfield. So I'm liking what I'm hearing, and I'm keen to see a little bit more. I hope they do a bit more of a deep dive when it comes to the actual systems in the space combat of the game. So character creation and customization. Ryan McCaffrey asks how many backgrounds there are. Todd says roughly 20 or so. They keep adding and removing ones as they go, but it's like a class. You start, here are your starting skills. There is dialogue that works in with this choice. We also saw that in the gameplay reveal. And he says there are other options in the game that are affected by your character creation. So if you're a diplomat, for instance, you can hear in the trailer or the gameplay reveal that the character refers to you as a diplomat, and how your leadership skills are probably going to come in handy in the game. Other examples, and I don't need to recall these, but there's the Beast Hunter, the Chef that Todd likes, etc. And what he really likes are the starting skills, so gastronomy, knives, wellness, etc. He says that it makes for more interesting role-playing and not just like shooting along the game, so it affects dialogue, crafting, leadership, etc. And again, this is stuff that I think is exactly what we need in an RPG, especially with Fallout 4 that went away from it a little bit, that more hardcore aspects of role-playing. It seems like Todd and the team are really focusing on bringing that back to really make sure that role-playing makes you feel like a significantly different character from each playthrough to each playthrough. You know what I mean? Like Fallout 4 is very, very samey, and you could eventually, if you kept playing the game, get everything, right? But hopefully this makes you, focus a little bit more, become a little bit more niche when it comes to your characters, and then on your next playthrough, you pick a completely different character, you role-play someone different, and then it actually makes your experience in terms of the dialogue and everything like that, and makes it feel a little bit different and unique. So hopefully that's what we get. It sounds promising, but we'll see when the game actually comes out. The next major talking point was about New Atlantis City. Ryan McCaffrey asked what you can do there. Todd says that there are 4 main cities in the game, and New Atlantis is the biggest, and the biggest city that they've ever built in any video game that they've made ever, which is insane. He says that New Atlantis is the capital in the game. They have all the typical servers that you could expect. You can work on your ship there. The factions are in there as well, etc. And it's also the headquarters of Constellation, the main faction that you join, which is the last group of space explorers, and that's essentially, what the main quest is involved within. So again, this sounds really cool. If there are only 4 main cities, I will say this: I hope that they're really massive and thought out. New Atlantis seems like it is, but like the other cities, Neon, if it's a main city or not, I hope that that's also massive, because if you look like a game like Skyrim, for instance, had more than just 4 main cities. There are a decent number of main cities in Skyrim. eventually they all feel kind of the same, but hopefully if there's just 4 main cities in Starfield, that they actually are massive, they all feel very different. But I still want to see smaller outposts, I still want to see smaller cities, and I'm sure that there are. He was just asked a specific question about New Atlantis, but New Atlantis seems very cool. It seems like a place where you could spend tons of hours in, hopefully a lot of side quests, and a lot of quests I've picked up there, a lot of characters that you can talk to, maybe some companions to pick up. So it all sounds promising, but hopefully we can see a little bit more in the future. The second last point was about the main story. Ryan McCaffrey just asked Todd if he can talk a little bit more about the main story. Todd says Constellation is about exploring and figuring out the mysteries of the universe. They're also looking for old Earth artifacts. They've uncovered some of these artifacts, but they don't know their origin, and that's the main quest that you start on. In terms of length, it's ending up a little bit longer than their previous main quest, around 20% longer. So let's say if, Skyrim or whatever main quest in the past was like 25 hours, Starfield might be anywhere from the 30s to 40s, depending upon how slow you take it. But all the other quests, faction lines, etc., there's a lot of other content in the game, which is awesome. He also says, of course, that there's going to be extra content and DLC, and he stresses that the modding community is important and the game is going to be a dream for them. So, one, I'm glad that he mentioned modding. I'm glad that we know that modding is going to be happening. I'm sure that the kit is not going to be out straight away on launch. I don't believe it ever has been with a BGS game. Someone correct me on that. But eventually, once the actual tools are released for modders and they can work on the game properly, then we start seeing really awesome mods. I hope that someone does ask Todd in a future interview when that's going to happen, because I feel like that's when the game is going to get into the next gear. With the amount of planets that you have in that game, it's going to be a modder's paradise. Like, a modder can just pick a planet and say, you know what, I'm going to create an awesome planet. It's going to be unique. Going to be side quests there. It's like it writes itself, really. So I think that's freaking awesome. Hopefully you get that as soon as possible. As I said, the main quest, the storyline, isn't anything to write home about. It seems pretty cookie cutter for a space game. Pretty as you expect. But I still like the concept. I like the idea of exploring in space. It's something that personally I've always found very interesting. Galaxies, universe, the space, etc. The whole thing about looking for old Earth artifacts is something that I can't talk too much about. But yeah, they've uncovered them. They don't know their origin. It seems like something that can actually just keep you going along in the game. So we'll see how it actually fleshes out. I wanted to touch on the length a little bit. I think, as we know, like, the main quest in BGS games isn't exactly the thing that everyone remembers fondly. I know so many people that have put hundreds of hours into Skyrim and not even touched the main quest. Like, it's never been the main bit of the game. But I do like that there's a little bit of content in there. Like, 30 to 40 hours for me for a main quest BGS, that sounds perfect. I think that's absolutely ideal. And then it's still going to take us hundreds of hours to play other areas of the game. And I assume most of us are going to put that main quest on the back burner as we explore the 1,000 planets and do all the side quests and all the faction lines. It seems like there is a decent number of bit of content in the game. What I just wish I would have seen, or we would have seen in the official gameplay reveal, was the section that focused a lot on that, on the side questing, the companion questing, if there's any of that, the faction lines. I would have liked to have seen a section on that, because we got a very brief overview of the main story and that was about it. I think anyone else that doesn't know BGS looking at that game, they might not think that there was actually a lot of content in the game when it came to all this other stuff. So I wish they had done it then, but I can see why they might be saving it for another presentation, another thing in the future, another event. So I think that's the next thing that we do need to see. We do need to see how involved the side questing is, how involved the companion is, how many factions there are, and how many things you can actually do with them. That's going to be key for me. So finally, Todd gets asked by Ryan whether you can fly a ship straight down to a planet. And Todd says straight out, no. The surface is one reality, and in space, it's another reality. If you do try and engineer the in-between, it's not that important to the player, he says. They've tried to just make each reality awesome and look as good as they can be. I very much expected this. I didn't think that there was going to be flying, straight from the atmosphere or whatever into the planet. I think it would have exploded the creation engine. Just performance-wise, I don't think that would have worked. But also, like, I can see what Todd means. Like, how important is it for you to be able to go from the surface of the planet right up to the top? Like, it's a nice in between, but unless there's actually a fun gameplay with it, after about 2 or 3 times, it just gets boring. Like, who really cares? So yeah, I think his focus is in the right place, especially for performance. I think it does matter not to have a lot of those convoluted systems. So yeah, I think it's just a good point that he mentioned, and that Maybe some of you are disappointed. I don't know. But anyways, that was the interview that Todd did with Ryan of IGN. A lot of interesting information in there. I think it all sounds good. Some red flags here and there, but I'm keen to get your thoughts in the comments below, Wastelanders. But until next time, this has been Lone. Please take care of yourselves, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.